Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. Imagine rowing a tiny wooden boat through the pitch-black, fog-choked waters of the River Thames at like 2 in the morning.
Oh, that sounds absolutely terrifying.
Right, your hands are freezing, the current is just pulling at you, and you are actively risking an international incident with armed Spanish guards patrolling the deck right above you.
And all of this just to deliver a book.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Your objective is to silently slip a parcel of Protestant Bibles through a ship's porthole without getting caught. I mean, that wasn't an excerpt from an espionage novel. That was literally just a Tuesday for a London city missionary back in 1868.
Yeah, the physical reality of that scene really sets the tone for everything we're going to explore in this deep dive. Because we are stepping into the daily logs of 361 men who operated in an environment that was, well, it was buckling under the weight of its own unprecedented expansion.
Yeah, because we're talking about Victorian London here.
Right, specifically 1868 and 1869. And the city was absorbing 40,000 to 50,000 new residents every single year.
Which is an insane number.
It's massive. The infrastructure, the sanitation, the social safety nets, none of it could handle that influx.
And I think the most incredible part of this deep dive is how we actually know about all this. Like, we aren't relying on some sanitized high-level history written decades later by an academic who, only saw the slums from the window of a passing carriage.
Right, the sources are completely raw.
Exactly. Our source material today consists of the unfiltered field reports from the London City Mission magazine, specifically volumes 33 and 34.
Mm-hmm.
So for you listening, we are getting the street-level view of a metropolis operating at the absolute extremes of human experience.
These reports act as a vital sociological artifact, really. The missionaries who wrote them were forced to navigate this rapidly exploding city where the Industrial Revolution was producing both staggering wealth and just unimaginable squalor.
Yeah, the contrast must have been jarring.
It was. They were deployed into the slums, the ship docks, the public houses, the workhouses. They were effectively mapping out the social and spiritual geography of the world's largest city.
So to give you a framework for what these individuals were actually doing, think of them as the Victorian equivalent of, like, hyper-local street social workers.
That's a great way to look at it.
Yeah, because they were assigned to very specific geographic patches. They knew the alleys, they knew the families, they really understood the localized economies of the slums.
But they were operating under a strictly spiritual mandate. That's the key difference.
Right. They weren't sent by the government to fix the plumbing. They were sent by an independent mission to save souls. And that specific mandate led to a set of operational rules and methods that we really need to scrutinize carefully.
Yeah, the methods were born out of a very specific philosophy of poverty and relief. And before we can even evaluate the success or failure of their work in all these various environments, we have to understand the absolute constraint placed upon them by their leadership.
The big rule.
The big rule, exactly. The Committee of the London City Mission issued a formal circular in December of 1867, laying down a non-negotiable law for every single missionary in the field.
And this is what's called the no alms mandate. The rule essentially dictates that souls must be prioritized over silver.
Right. The circular explicitly forbade missionaries from giving temporal relief of any kind. I mean, they could not distribute money, food, clothing, fuel, nothing.
Wait, not even a piece of bread?
Not even that. Furthermore, the rule went so far as to prohibit the missionaries from even writing letters to wealthy individuals or benefactors to solicit aid on behalf of the distressed people they encountered. They were entirely stripped of the power to provide material help.
I have to just unpack the absolute severity of this for a second. Imagine a missionary walks into a room in the London slum in the dead of winter. There's no fire in the grate. The family is quite literally starving, maybe suffering from exposure.
Yeah, a very common scenario.
And the missionary is supposed to look at a shivering child, withhold a loaf of bread or a shilling, and instead offer, like, a religious tract and a prayer. I mean, it feels akin to a physician walking into an emergency room, looking at a patient in agonizing pain and refusing to give anesthetics because they only want to cure the underlying disease.
It's a tough pill to swallow.
The refusal to treat the immediate screaming symptom just feels so callous.
The optics are undeniably harsh to a modern observer, I'll give you that. However, The historical record provides a deep philosophical justification for this policy. It was heavily influenced by the leading sociological thinkers of the era.
Right. The text mentions a couple of them.
Yes, it specifically cites Dr. Thomas Chalmers. He was a Scottish minister and political economist who wrote extensively on Christian economics, as well as the writings of Dr. Thomas Guthrie.
So what was the core argument of Chalmers' economics that justified letting people go hungry in the presence of a missionary? Like, how did they rationalize that?
Well, Chalmers argued that combining spiritual instruction with physical, material charity inherently corrupts the relationship.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah. The prevailing belief was that if a missionary arrived with both a Bible and a basket of food, the residents would just feign spiritual awakening simply to access the food. The mission's text actually uses the phrase pretense and hypocrisy.
Wow.
They believed that material benevolence turned religious conversion into a transaction. If the missionary became a dispenser of funds, he ceased to be a spiritual guide and just became a patron.
I mean, it makes sense from an incentive standpoint. It creates an incentive structure for lying. If my family's survival depends on me nodding along to your sermon, you better believe I will become the most devout listener you have ever seen, at least until the bread is handed over.
Precisely. And Chalmers maintained that a religious instructor must be entirely disembarrassed from secular ministrations to be effective.
Disembarrassed from secular ministrations. That is such a Victorian way of saying don't hand out cash.
It really is. But the goal was to win genuine affection and effect true moral transformation. The text points out that when a missionary enters a desperate neighborhood completely stripped of all power, patronage, and pecuniary administration, and still manages to win the trust and love of the people, that represents a genuine moral victory.
So they wanted to ensure the missionaries were loved for their care and counsel, not for their coin.
Exactly.
The phrase the text uses is removing the materialism of benevolence, which sounds nice on paper, but philosophy doesn't put calories into a starving body. Did the missionaries just turn a blind eye and let people freeze, like practically speaking?
No, the practical application was actually a lot more nuanced than the strict rule implies. The missionaries were deeply affected by the suffering they witnessed. They were human, after all. So they were instructed to operate essentially as a triage unit. When they encountered acute starvation or absolute destitution, they were expected to evaluate the need and then immediately refer the case to specialized lay committees, district visitors, or relief agencies whose sole explicit purpose was to provide temporal relief.
Ah, okay, that reframes it slightly. So it's like the triage nurse in the ER who evaluates the trauma but doesn't actually perform the surgery, right? They direct the patient to the surgical team.
That's a perfect analogy.
A London City mission separated the spiritual intervention from the material intervention to ensure neither compromised the other.
It was a strict division of labor based on Victorian ideals of self-reliance. Because the overarching goal of the mission wasn't just to alleviate temporary hunger, it was to permanently elevate the poor.
To fix the root cause, in their eyes.
Exactly. The belief was that spiritual awakening would instill moral discipline. A reformed man would stop spending his meager wages in the public house. He would become more industrious. He would practice providence, saving for the future, and thereby pull his own family out of poverty.
It's an entirely bottom-up approach to social reform, starting with the inner character rather than the external circumstances.
Spot on.
So armed with this strictly spiritual toolkit, the missionaries were deployed into environments where the external circumstances were almost universally horrifying. And this is where we need to look at the permanent, static slums.
The really entrenched areas.
Yeah, the areas where poverty wasn't a temporary state, but a geographical trap. The reports dedicate significant space to the district of St. Giles's, specifically the Little Queen Street district.
St. Giles has held a notorious reputation in Victorian London. To the broader public, the very name was basically synonymous with vice, crime, and inescapable squalor. The specific boundaries of the Little Queen Street patch fell between Holborn and Lincoln's Inn Fields. And the statistics provided by the assigned missionary reveal a suffocating level of density.
How dense are we talking?
Within his designated area, there were only about 120 houses considered visitable.
Okay, so if we visualize 120 houses, we are talking about a very small physical footprint, maybe 3 or 4 dense streets.
Right.
Yet the missionary reports that those 120 houses contain between 650 and 700 distinct families. The concentration of humanity is just staggering. You were looking at nearly 6 families crammed into a single standard Victorian terrace house.
And we have to remember, these were not spacious buildings.
No, not at all. We're talking about families of 5, 6, 7 people living entirely within the confines of a single, poorly ventilated room. And they're sharing a single privy in a courtyard with dozens of other people.
The physical environment alone just breeds disease and despair. But the missionaries' report goes further to explain the economic forces driving this hyperconcentration, because the people weren't flocking to St. Giles's because it was desirable.
Obviously not.
They were being forced into it by the march of urban progress. The sources point directly to the wholesale demolition of neighboring districts.
So the modernization of London was basically acting as a bulldozer. The city was constructing the massive Holborn Valley Viaduct to accommodate the railways and making all these extensive changes to the Finsbury estates.
Yep. And when you demolish cheap working-class housing to build infrastructure, the displaced population doesn't simply vanish. They're pushed into the adjacent neighborhoods.
And that sudden influx of desperate renters allows landlords in places like St. Giles's to drastically increase rents.
Exactly. It forces families to sublet their already meager spaces just to survive. The railway brought immense wealth to the empire, but it brought absolute displacement to the urban poor.
So the missionary walks into an environment characterized by extreme physical compression and economic exploitation. But the friction wasn't just spatial. It was deeply cultural and fiercely political.
Very much so.
The report notes that out of those roughly 700 families, approximately 400 were Irish Romanists. And the year is 1868. So we really have to consider the massive geopolitical tensions filtering down into the alleys of St. Giles.
And we should clarify for everyone listening, we aren't taking sides on these historical, political, or religious conflicts. We're simply reporting how this context made the missionaries' work incredibly dangerous.
Absolutely. We're just looking at the facts on the ground as they were reported.
Right. So the missionary found himself acting as a proxy for massive macro-political grievances. 2 major movements were radicalizing the population at the time. First, there was Fenianism, which was the Irish Republican movement dedicated to establishing an independent Irish republic, often through violent means.
And the Clerkenwell explosion had just happened, right?
Yes, that was a deadly bombing carried out by Fenians in London just months prior, in late 1867. So the English public was deeply suspicious of the Irish, and the Irish felt entirely marginalized and oppressed by English authority.
And then on top of the Irish Republican tension, you have the Garibaldian riots. These were manifestations happening across Europe against the Pope's temporal power in Italy, led by Giuseppe Garibaldi.
And for the Irish Catholic population in St. Giles, the Pope wasn't just a religious figure. He was the ultimate symbol of their faith and identity under siege. When Garibaldi's supporters protested against the papacy, the Irish in London viewed it as an existential attack.
Which makes total sense from their perspective.
The missionary explicitly notes that the Irish were fiercely protective of the papacy.
So it is entirely logical that a Protestant English missionary knocking on their door would be viewed not as a spiritual guide, but as an agent of the hostile, oppressive state that was simultaneously executing their political leaders and cheering for the downfall of their religious leader.
Exactly. The mechanism of hostility was direct and visceral. The missionary reports that because of these larger European political movements, his daily work became physically dangerous. Doors that might have previously been opened with cautious curiosity were violently slammed shut.
Wow.
He was subjected to curses, threats, and he chillingly notes that many residents possessed the will to destroy the missionaries entirely, lacking only the legal power and opportunity to do so.
The hostility from the politically aware residents makes sense. But the psychological landscape of St. Giles also included profound, almost medieval levels of superstition. There is this anecdote in the text that perfectly illustrates the extreme educational chasm of the era.
Oh, the story about the woman in Parker Street.
Yes. The missionary describes attempting to visit a woman living in Parker Street, and she absolutely refuses to let him cross the threshold. And her reasoning wasn't political anger. She genuinely believed that if she disobeyed her priest by speaking to a Protestant missionary, the priest possessed the literal supernatural power to transform her into a dog or a cat.
And the text emphasizes the utter sincerity of her terror. She wasn't using a metaphor. She claimed to know of another woman who had recently been transfigured into an animal for committing that exact offense.
I mean, how do you even begin a conversation in that reality? You have the juxtaposition of London building the world's first underground railways, laying telegraph cables across the ocean and pushing the boundaries of modern engineering. And then, literally a mile away in a cramped room, a woman is living in sheer terror of supernatural transfiguration.
It exposes the profound isolation of the slum. These residents were entirely cut off from the educational and scientific advancements happening mere streets away. The adult illiteracy rate was staggering.
And when a population cannot read, their reliance on the oral authority of their religious and community leaders becomes absolute.
Exactly. The missionary's challenge wasn't merely debating theology. He was attempting to pierce a layer of ingrained fear that had been cultivated by centuries of systemic educational disenfranchisement.
Now, while St. Giles represents the trap of the static slums people defending their tiny, overcrowded corners, London also contained an immense population of the transient poor. These were the vagrants who had slipped below the level of even the worst tenement housing, the lowest of the low. Yeah, and to reach them, the missionaries had to follow them into the most feared institutions in Victorian Britain, the workhouses and the casual wards.
The casual wards were essentially triage centers for utter destitution. The missionary assigned to the Holborn Hill casual wards provides a snapshot of this transient population, recording interactions with over 1,200 men and 300 women in a single year.
The term casual feels wildly inappropriate to modern ears. We use it to mean relaxed or informal. But in 1868, a casual pauper was someone existing on the razor's edge of survival.
Right. The Victorian legal definition of a casual pauper was a destitute wayfarer or vagrant. These were individuals with no permanent parish settlement, no home, no tools for a trade, and crucially, no character.
Character being the Victorian term for references or a reputation that an employer would trust.
Precisely. They moved constantly. When they faced starvation or freezing on the streets, they could surrender themselves to a casual ward for a single night's shelter and a meager ration of bread and gruel.
But it wasn't a charity hotel. It was a highly penal environment. They were locked in the wards overnight, and in the morning, they were forced to perform hours of grueling manual labor like breaking stones to pay for their meager accommodation before being released back onto the street.
And the text anchors this reality by mentioning a really specific historical touchstone. The missionary actually conversed with the hero of James Greenwood's famous undercover expose, A Night in a Workhouse.
Oh, that's such a fascinating connection.
It really is. James Greenwood was a journalist who disguised himself as a vagrant and spent a night in the Lambeth casual ward. His subsequent publication shocked polite society by exposing the horrific, degrading, and unsanitary conditions inside.
So the fact that our missionary is operating in the very environment Greenwood exposed, talking to the same individuals, it just underscores the extreme misery of his daily assignment.
Now, the transient casuals were just one side of the system. The reports also detail the work at the Marylebone Workhouse, which housed the more permanent, able-bodied inmates.
Right, and the missionary there ministered to over 500 people. And the labor they were subjected to was designed to be intentionally awful. The report lists hair-picking and oakum-picking as their primary occupations.
Oakum-picking was the quintessential punishment labor of the Victorian era.
Can you explain what that actually entails? Because it sounds awful.
It really was. It involved taking old, heavily tarred ropes salvaged from ships and unpicking them, strand by rigid strand, using only your bare fingers. The goal was to reduce the thick rope down to loose fibers, which were then resold to shipyards to be mixed with fresh tar and used for caulking the seams of wooden ships.
It is difficult to overstate how physically agonizing that work was. The tar made the ropes incredibly stiff. Within hours, the friction would literally tear the skin off the inmates' fingers, leaving them bleeding and raw.
And they had to meet a strict quota of picked oakum every day or face further punishment.
And hair-picking was a similarly monotonous agony, right? Tearing apart matted, dusty horsehair to be used in cheap upholstery. Both tasks were chosen because they required zero skill, provided virtually no economic value, and served purely to make the workhouse environment so miserable that only the absolute most desperate would seek it out.
It was the principle of less eligibility. The state ensured that life inside the workhouse was always worse than the lowest possible standard of life outside it.
Which is incredibly bleak.
Yeah. You have 500 people sitting in cavernous, silent rooms, hands bleeding, engaged in soul-crushing, mind-numbing repetition. The psychological toll of that environment is total institutionalization. You are stripped of your name, your clothing, your autonomy, and your humanity. You are treated purely as a burden on the parish tax rates.
So my question is, how does a missionary even penetrate that level of institutionalized despair? If a man's entire existence has been reduced to bleeding fingers and tarred rope, why would he care about a religious tract?
The breakthrough often came through the mechanism of simple, radical respect. There's a deeply poignant detail in the Marylebone report.
Oh, the barbershop Bible.
Yes. The missionary left a Bible in the workhouse barber shop. He inscribed it with a simple message, lent by the London City Mission. And later, he reports the profound joy of walking down the bleak halls of the workhouse and hearing the inmates actually reading that specific Bible aloud to one another.
It became a focal point of shared humanity. In a place designed to isolate and punish, the text provided a reason to gather and communicate.
The mechanism of the missionary's success in the workhouse relied entirely on the contrast between his behavior and the behavior of the state. The workhouse master and the parish overseers treated the paupers as a nuisance to be managed.
But the missionary was different.
The missionary was often the only person to cross the threshold who treated them as citizens. He looked a man in the eye, ignored the workhouse uniform, and spoke to him as an immortal soul possessing infinite value. When society has completely discarded you, having an educated figure declare that your life has ultimate spiritual significance is a profoundly disarming and restorative experience.
That restoration of dignity was powerful in the workhouses. But the missionaries also recognized that the majority of London wasn't locked in a ward. They were driving the massive, dangerous engine of the British Empire.
The working class.
Right. And if the mission wanted to reach the working men, they couldn't wait in the chapels. They had to intercept the men where the labor was actually happening. This required a massive tactical shift toward industrial visitation.
They deployed men directly to the infrastructure of commerce. Let's examine the London and Northwestern Railway terminus at Euston. The missionaries systematically targeted the railway shunters, the cabmen, and the night cabmen waiting at the stands outside the station.
The report includes a really fascinating 20-year retrospective on the cabmen mission. It contrasts the present day of 1868 with the conditions 2 decades prior.
What was it like in the 1840s?
In the 1840s, the cab stands were notorious for frightful swearing, heavy drinking, and frequent brawls. It was a really rough, coarse environment. But by 1868, the missionaries had engineered a brilliant intervention. They set up small lending libraries directly on the cabs themselves.
It is a phenomenal example of meeting the worker within the rhythms of his trade. A cabman spends hours waiting for a fare. By providing books, the missionary captured that idle time.
They turned waiting around into reading time.
Exactly. The cabbies would read the literature while waiting and then exchange the books every fortnight when the missionary returned. They turned a space of idle vice into a space of informal education.
But while the cab stands saw improvement, the men working inside the railway yards faced a daily reality of extreme physical danger. The report details the life of a railway shunter. These were the men whose job was to manually couple and uncouple the massive, heavy train cars as the engines pushed them together.
It was highly lethal work. One slip meant being crushed between tons of moving iron.
Yet, the report highlights that the ultimate tragedy for one particular shunter didn't come from the iron of the railway, but from the water of the city. The missionary recounts the harrowing story of a shunter who lost 3 of his children in the span of 3 weeks to cholera.
3 children in 3 weeks. The sheer velocity of that grief is paralyzing.
It is. You survive the lethal railway yard for 12 hours, only to return to a home where a waterborne disease is systematically wiping out your entire family.
Cholera was the terrifying equalizer of the Victorian slum. It thrived in the exact lack of sanitation we discussed earlier in St. Giles. The loss of 3 children is unimaginable today, but it was a distressingly common reality then.
And the missionary's report notes that it was this profound, inescapable grief that finally drove the shunter to seek out spiritual awakening. In an era before grief counseling or trauma therapy, the missionary served as the sole psychological support system, guiding this man through a tragedy that might otherwise have resulted in total collapse or severe alcoholism.
The fragility of working-class life is further emphasized by the sheer scale of the industrial environments the missionaries penetrated. The statistics are wild. In Bermondsey alone, missionaries reported visiting 60 different tan yards, along with 22 massive gasworks across the city.
To understand the commitment required for this, you really have to mentally recreate the sensory assault of a Victorian industrial site. Bermondsey was the center of London's leatherworking industry. A tan yard was a place of noxious, overwhelming odors.
They used harsh chemicals, lime, and large quantities of dog waste collected off the streets by the poorest of the poor to soften the raw animal hides. The smell was suffocating.
And The gasworks were even more intense. These were massive complexes where coal was superheated to produce the gas that lit the city's streets and homes. They were incredibly dangerous, blisteringly hot, and filled with toxic fumes.
Not an easy place to preach.
Not at all. I visualized the missionaries' approach as a grim precursor to a modern corporate wellness program. But instead of a human resources department bringing in a meditation coach to an air-conditioned break room, you have a man in a soot-stained coat offering impromptu Bible studies in the sweltering stoke rooms, literally shouting over the roar of the furnaces during the men's brief meal breaks.
The adaptability required was immense. The missionaries knew they couldn't deliver a 40-minute formal theological lecture in a stokeroom. The reports note that they held short, punchy meetings. They encouraged questions.
Keep it quick, keep it engaging.
Right. They distributed accessible illustrated literature like The British Workman, which resonated with the men's experiences. They stripped away the formality of religion and delivered the core message in the vernacular of the factory floor.
But the reality was, when that factory whistle blew and the men finally clocked out of the gasworks and the tan yards, their first destination was never a church. The source material is brutally honest about this. The missionaries explicitly state that the artisans and laborers harbored a fixed dislike to the house of God and genuinely believed that the grand churches of London were never built for them.
That is a critical sociological observation. The Victorian Church of England was highly structured. Many churches operated on a system of pew rents, where wealthy families paid to reserve the best seats.
The liturgy was formal, the clothing expectations were high, and the language was often disconnected from the reality of manual labor.
Exactly. To a working-class man exhausted from the tan yard, entering a pristine church filled with the upper classes felt entirely alien. The architecture and the economics of the church implicitly told him he did not belong.
Recognizing this massive cultural barrier, the London City Mission made a fascinating tactical decision. If the men won't step into the spaces of righteousness, the mission must invade the spaces of leisure and vice. Which leads us to the grand theater services.
The mission rented out massive entertainment venues, most notably the Royal Amphitheatre in Holborn. And the scale of this outreach was unprecedented. The text reports that over 232 services were held in these venues, boasting a staggering total attendance of 500,000 men over the course of the campaign.
Just imagine the chaotic energy of that room. You have a grand Victorian theater with its plush seating and gilded balconies, completely packed with a demographic that polite society actively avoided.
The text describes the audience vividly. You've got costermongers pushing their way in, street musicians, known thieves, and what the Victorians referred to as the swell mob, the organized pickpockets and grifters.
All of them sitting shoulder to shoulder to listen to a 45-minute sermon.
The environment demanded a completely different style of communication. The source material includes a quote from one of the preachers that perfectly captures their pragmatism. He acknowledged that he had to abandon traditional homiletics and introduce lively anecdotes, bold illustrations, and dramatic flair just to hold their attention.
He said, "It is a very shocking thing, no doubt, to save a drowning man in a grotesque way and without regard to the properties. But I would rather do it, if I could, than stand upon my dignity and let him sink."
That quote is the thesis statement for the entire organization, really. They were willing to sacrifice the dignity of the pulpit if it meant actually reaching the drowning man.
But renting a theater is one thing. You still control the stage. The absolute boldest move the mission made was assigning 8 missionaries exclusively to operate inside the public houses and coffee shops of Westminster and South London.
The public house mission. In terms of sociological intervention, this is perhaps the most fascinating and dangerous assignment of all.
Hold on, preaching inside a Victorian pub. That sounds like a guaranteed recipe for severe physical trauma. You are taking a man, holding a Bible, and sending him into a crowded, smoke-filled Victorian pub packed with exhausted, highly intoxicated men whose entire culture revolves around drinking and fighting. How does the missionary not get immediately and violently thrown into the cobblestone street?
The expected outcome is hostility, sure, but the text reveals a highly counterintuitive dynamic. The missionaries report that the landlords, the publicans who ran these establishments, actually welcomed their presence.
Why would a man whose profit depends on selling alcohol welcome a man whose goal is to stop men from drinking? It doesn't make business sense.
It comes down to the mechanics of crowd control and atmosphere. The Victorian pub was often a powder keg. Fights were constant, property damage was high, and the landlords frequently struggled to maintain control over the roughs.
So the missionary walks in, and what happens?
When the missionary walked through the doors, he acted as a profoundly calming element. The sheer audacity of a sober, respectable figure entering that space completely unarmed seemed to disarm the hostility.
That's incredible.
The men respected the bravery, the foul language would drop, the aggression would temper. The missionary brought an aura of outside authority and moral weight that suppressed the violence without inciting a riot.
He essentially functioned as a psychological bouncer. A police officer walking into a pub represents the threat of arrest, which often triggers a brawl. But a missionary represents a non-punitive authority. He isn't there to arrest you. He's there because he claims to care about you. It completely short-circuits the defensive aggression of the patrons.
Exactly. The landlords realized that allowing the missionary to speak for 10 minutes reduced the likelihood of their chairs being smashed over someone's head.
A very practical benefit.
But the missionary's perspective was even more radical. They didn't just view the pub as a den of iniquity to be destroyed. They recognized that for a man living in a squalid freezing room in St. Giles, the brightly lit, warm pub was the only communal living room available to him. One missionary wrote with staggering optimism that every public house may become a center of good.
To look at the epicenter of Victorian vice and see the potential for a community center requires immense empathy. It is the ability to look past the alcohol and see the human desperation for warmth and connection.
And that search for connection wasn't limited to the English and Irish laborers. London was the beating heart of a vast empire and a hub of global maritime trade. The pubs and docks were teeming with a vastly diverse multilingual population that was slipping entirely through the cracks of traditional English institutions.
So the mission had to adapt.
They did. The mission had to pivot from being a local outreach to managing a microcosm of global cultures.
This is where the work in the docks becomes so intense it genuinely resembles maritime smuggling, like we mentioned at the start. The London City Mission deployed 5 men specifically to the ship docks to engage with foreign sailors. And the stakes for some of these interactions were life or death, particularly regarding the Spanish crews.
The historical context here is critical. Before the Spanish Revolution, referred to in the text as the Revuelta, distributing Protestant religious material to Spanish citizens was strictly illegal.
The Spanish Catholic authorities fiercely guarded against what they viewed as Protestant heresy.
Right. If a Spanish sailor accepted a Bible in London and was later caught with it by the authorities upon returning to Spain, he faced severe persecution, imprisonment, or worse.
Because of that severe legal threat, the Spanish ships and the London docks were heavily guarded. Armed guards, known as carabineros, paced the decks to prevent anyone from boarding or passing contraband. So the missionaries couldn't just walk up the gangplank and hand out tracts. They had to operate in the shadows.
The reports detail a highly coordinated, covert operation. A missionary would wait until the dead of night. He would hire a small waterman's boat and quietly row out into the Thames, navigating the dangerous currents among the massive hulls of the moored ships.
And they had to bypass the carabiniero pacing above.
Yes, the missionary would coordinate with sympathetic officers or sailors below deck, silently slipping parcels of Bibles through the open ship portholes.
And the physical exertion didn't end with the drop-off. The text notes that to avoid detection and capture by the port authorities, the missionary would sometimes have to row 3 miles down the dark river before safely making landfall. The level of conviction required to risk drowning or an international diplomatic incident just to deliver a book is extraordinary.
It demonstrates the absolute primacy they placed on the written word. But not all of their foreign interactions were covert midnight operations. Some took place in the blazing sunlight, engaging the vibrant immigrant street cultures of London.
The Leather Lane Market provides a brilliant contrast to the docks. The missionary describes the scene on a Sunday morning. The street is crowded with Italian immigrants working as street vendors, selling cooling beverages and ice under the hot summer sun.
A very lively scene.
Amidst all the haggling, the commerce, and the noise, the missionary initiates deep philosophical debates with these vendors about the theological concept of purgatory.
It highlights the intellectual agility required of the missionaries. In the pub, they had to be brief and punchy. In the docks, they had to be stealthy. But here in Leather Lane, they were engaging in complex theological disputation with men deeply rooted in Italian Catholic doctrine. London wasn't monolithic. It was a chaotic, swirling melting pot of languages and beliefs, and the missionaries had to fluently speak the cultural language of each enclave.
That cultural fluency is most evident in how they structured the Jewish mission in East London. The mission specifically employed 4 converted Jewish missionaries to work within this community. They understood that an outsider would never gain the necessary trust. But what fascinates me is how their approach in East London heavily blurred the lines of the strict no alms rule we discussed earlier.
It is a prime example of the mission recognizing that pure spiritual instruction requires a foundation of basic survival. Alongside their readings of the Old and New Testaments, these 4 missionaries established a penny bank in Golston Street.
Explain the mechanics of the penny bank, because it seems to directly contradict the idea of not handling money.
A penny bank did not give out money, it took money in to secure it. The extremely poor lived hand to mouth. If they had an extra penny, the temptation or pressure to spend it immediately, often on alcohol, was immense. They had no access to traditional banking.
So the missionary stepped in to fill that void.
Yes. The missionary provided a secure, trusted ledger. An individual could deposit literally a single penny. Over weeks and months, those pennies would accumulate, providing a vital safety net for the winter when work dried up or coal was needed.
It was a system designed to build the exact providence and self-reliance that Dr. Chalmers preached about. And the scale of trust it generated is remarkable. The report states that in a single year, these incredibly poor individuals deposited a total of £95 into the Golston Street Penny Bank.
To contextualize that figure, in 1868, £95 was a tremendous sum of wealth. A highly skilled, fully employed laborer might earn £50 to £70 in an entire year.
Wow.
For the poorest demographic in East London to scrape together the equivalent of a year and a half of a middle-class salary, 1 penny at a time, proves 2 things. First, the intense discipline of the depositors. Second, the absolute unshakable trust they placed in the missionary holding their money.
If that missionary wasn't deeply embedded in the community, if he hadn't proven his character over years of visitation, no one would hand him their last penny. It is a triumph of relationship building.
And building relationships required following the people wherever they went, even if that meant leaving the city entirely. The reports detail how the missionaries tracked the transient populations out to the Epsom Downs during the famous race weeks.
The Derby Day races at Epsom were massive, chaotic festivals. The crowds were immense, drawing everyone from the highest aristocracy to the lowest street grifters. And setting up camp on the periphery of this chaos were the gypsies.
The gypsy population presented a unique and profound challenge to the standard operating procedures of the London City Mission. Their nomadic lifestyle meant they couldn't be visited regularly in a static home. But the more significant barrier was the total lack of literacy. The missionaries' report is blunt. Not a single adult in the encampment possessed the ability to read.
Handing a tract to a man who cannot read is worse than useless. It's condescending. So the primary tool of a mishaki, the written word, is entirely neutralized. How do you engage a marginalized, transient, illiterate population that is busy trying to earn a living off the race crowds?
You leverage the universal languages of hospitality and oral tradition. The missionaries partnered with the local Christian women of Epsom. They rented out a large barn near the encampment. Instead of demanding the gypsies attend a formal service, they hosted a massive feast.
Now we're talking.
They provided copious amounts of free tea, bread, butter, and plum cake.
I love this detail. Plum cake is essentially the Victorian equivalent of offering free pizza to get college students to attend a guest lecture. It is a foolproof strategy to gather a crowd.
And it worked beautifully. The gypsies flooded into the barn. The missionary notes with a touch of amusement that they were not at all shy about eating their fill and then cramming their pockets full of extra cake for the road.
Smart move on their part.
Very practical. But the strategy wasn't just about feeding them. While the gypsies ate, the missionary would stand and read the parables of Jesus aloud to the crowd.
Because the gypsy culture was entirely rooted in oral storytelling, the narrative structure of the parables resonated perfectly. They bypassed the barrier of illiteracy entirely by leaning into the cultural strengths of the audience. They adapted the message to fit the medium that people could actually consume.
It is the ultimate expression of the mission's tactical flexibility. Whether it was smuggling books through portholes, debating purgatory in the street markets, holding pennies in a slum bank, or serving plum cake in a barn, the missionaries constantly reshaped their methods to fit the precise contours of the people they were trying to reach.
When we pull back and look at the totality of what we've covered today, the sheer logistical and physical endurance required by these 361 men is staggering. We have tracked them from the claustrophobic, disease-ridden tenement of St. Giles into the silent, skin-tearing agony of the casual wards. We've seen them shouting over the roar of the gasworks, bringing quiet authority to violent public houses, and rowing through the freezing night on the Thames.
And they accomplished all of this on foot. There were no telephones to coordinate visits, no automobiles to cross the sprawling city, no modern databases to track the transient poor. They mapped the misery of the world's largest metropolis using nothing but shoe leather, written ledgers, and an unwavering belief in their mandate.
I want you to really consider the physical toll of that daily reality. To walk for 10 hours through the freezing fog, breathing in the noxious fumes of the tan yards, constantly exposed to cholera and typhus, facing down the hostility of politically enraged mobs and the heartbreaking grief of grieving parents. It requires a level of conviction that is almost difficult to comprehend today.
It is, and I think looking at their work leaves us with a profound, provocative question about how we structure our society today. In our modern era, we have highly compartmentalized the business of human care. If a person is struggling today, we divide their crisis into bureaucratic silos.
That's so true.
We assign a housing caseworker for their shelter, an urban planner to design their neighborhood, a psychological counselor for their trauma, a financial advisor for their debt, and a religious leader for their spiritual needs.
The care is highly specialized, but it is also highly fragmented. The struggling individual has to navigate half a dozen different agencies just to be seen as a whole person.
Exactly. But consider what these Victorian missionaries were actually practicing. They engaged in holistic, street-level immersion. The missionary assigned to the Euston Railway didn't just know the theology of the shunter. He knew the exact physical danger the man faced. He knew the smell of the yard. He sat with the man as he wept over his children dying of cholera. He understood the total environment of the individual.
So the question becomes, did the intense geographic immersion of these missionaries, even though it was driven by a strict, sometimes controversial theological mandate, inadvertently lay the foundation for modern sociology and urban social work?
I genuinely believe it did. If you strip away the Victorian religious language for a moment, look at the core action taking place. A person of relative privilege intentionally walking into the most neglected, isolated, and dangerous parts of the city, sitting down with a forgotten human being, looking them in the eye, and treating them with absolute dignity.
It's a powerful image.
They documented the systemic causes of poverty, they recognized the need for community spaces, and they fought the dehumanization of the state institutions. Aren't we, more than a century and a half later, still trying to solve that exact same problem of urban isolation?
We absolutely are. The technology has changed, the terminology has evolved, and the cities have grown taller. But the fundamental human need to be seen, to be valued, and to be understood in the midst of a massive, indifferent system remains exactly the same.
The ledgers of history may seem dry at first glance, but when you read the field notes of the people on the ground, you realize that the struggle for human dignity has always been a messy, muddy, and intensely personal endeavor.
That is an incredibly powerful thought to leave on. Thank you to everyone listening for joining us on this deep dive into the fog, the factories, and the fiercely human streets of Victorian London.
It has been a fascinating journey.
Until next time, keep looking past the neat columns of history to find the real stories underneath. Goodbye, everyone.